Harrison Ford was standing in his kitchen at 3:17 a.m., holding a phone that had just gone silent. The man who had been his closest friend for 4 decades had just said something so devastating that Ford couldn't breathe. Steven Spielberg's voice still echoed in his ears. "Harrison, I can't do this anymore. I can't watch you destroy yourself and pretend everything's fine." The phone slipped from Ford's hand and clattered onto the marble countertop. In 40 years of friendship, through 5 Indiana Jones films, countless dinners, family celebrations, and Hollywood battles, Steven had never spoken to him like that. But what Spielberg had just revealed about Ford's behavior, what he'd been hiding from everyone, including himself, would change everything between them forever. But to understand why the most powerful director in Hollywood was calling his biggest star at 3 a.m. with words that would nearly destroy their friendship, you need to know what had been building between Steven Spielberg and Harrison Ford for months. It started with something so small that Ford didn't even notice it happening. October 15, 2023. The set of Indiana Jones 5 had wrapped 6 months earlier, but Ford was still carrying something from those final days of filming. Something that was slowly eating away at the man who had spent 50 years projecting invincible confidence. Ford was sitting in his home office in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, staring at an email from Lucasfilm. They wanted to discuss future opportunities and legacy projects. The words felt like a euphemism for something he wasn't ready to face: the end. At 81 years old, Harrison Ford had become Hollywood's most reluctant legend. He'd spent decades running from the very characters that made him famous, only to realize that those characters might be all he had left. But the real problem wasn't his age. It wasn't even his reluctance to embrace his iconic status. The problem was what he'd started doing when the cameras stopped rolling and the crowds went home. Spielberg had noticed it first during the final weeks of Indiana Jones filming. Small things: Ford forgetting crew members' names, people he'd worked with for decades, repeating stories he'd told just hours earlier, standing in doorways looking confused about where he was supposed to be. But it was more than that. Ford had started drinking alone. Not the social drinking that had always been part of his routine, but the kind of drinking that happens in empty houses when nobody's watching. The kind that starts at lunch and continues until sleep finally comes. Steven Spielberg, the man who had directed Ford through some of cinema's greatest adventures, was watching his friend disappear in real time, and nobody else seemed to notice. The two men had met in 1977 when Spielberg was casting Raiders of the Lost Ark. Ford was 35, still primarily known as Han Solo, hungry to prove he could be more than a space smuggler. Spielberg was 30, fresh off Jaws and Close Encounters, looking for an actor who could embody both vulnerability and strength. Their partnership was immediate and electric. Ford brought a wounded masculinity to Indiana Jones that Spielberg's camera captured perfectly. But more than that, they understood each other's need for perfection, their shared Midwestern work ethic, their uncomfortable relationship with fame. Over the decades, their friendship had deepened beyond movies. Spielberg had been there when Ford's first marriage crumbled. Ford had been there when Spielberg struggled with the pressures of being Hollywood's golden boy. They'd shared family dinners, private doubts, and the strange burden of creating characters that would outlive them both. But something had shifted after Indiana Jones 5 wrapped. Ford seemed lost without the structure of filming, without the daily purpose that had defined his life for 5 decades. He was making appearances at awards shows and giving interviews, but Spielberg could see that Ford was going through the motions of being Harrison Ford, rather than actually living as him. The drinking got worse. Ford would call Spielberg at odd hours, rambling about projects that would never happen, about regrets that seemed to multiply in the darkness. He'd repeat himself, lose track of conversations, and then angrily deny that anything was wrong when people tried to help. Spielberg found himself covering for Ford in ways that felt increasingly desperate. When Ford missed a scheduled appearance at a film festival, Spielberg made excuses. When Ford showed up to a charity event clearly intoxicated, Spielberg quietly arranged for him to leave early. When Ford started canceling dinner plans at the last minute, Spielberg stopped making them. But the breaking point came on October 14, 2023, at a private screening in Los Angeles. Ford had been invited to introduce a retrospective of his films at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. It should have been a celebration, a moment for one of cinema's great stars to reflect on his legacy. Instead, it became the night Spielberg realized he might lose his friend forever. Ford arrived 40 minutes late, his hair unkempt, his famous composure nowhere to be found. He took the stage and began speaking, but the words came out jumbled and repetitive. He told the same anecdote 3 times, forgot which film he was supposed to be discussing, and at one point called out to people in the audience who weren't there. The crowd sat in uncomfortable silence. These were industry veterans, people who'd worked with Ford for decades, and they were watching one of their heroes fall apart in real time. Spielberg, sitting in the 3rd row, felt his heart breaking. This wasn't just an off night or stage nerves. This was something much more serious. This was a man who was disappearing from his own life. After the event, Spielberg found Ford in the parking lot, fumbling with his car keys. "Harrison, let me drive you home." "I'm fine, Steven. Just tired." "You're not fine, and you shouldn't be driving." Ford looked at his friend with eyes that seemed both angry and lost. "Don't start with that. I've been taking care of myself longer than you've been alive. You're 6 years older than me, Harrison, and right now you're acting like someone who needs help." Ford got in his car and drove away, leaving Spielberg standing alone under the streetlights, wondering how to save a friend who didn't want to be saved. For the next 3 days, Spielberg tried calling Ford. The calls went to voicemail. Text messages went unanswered. Ford had effectively disappeared from everyone who cared about him, retreating to his Wyoming ranch where he could drink alone and avoid the questions he wasn't ready to answer. But on October 18th, Spielberg received a call that changed everything. It was Callista Flockhart, Ford's wife. Her voice was shaking. "Steven, I need your help. Something's happened to Harrison, and I don't know what to do." Ford had been found by a neighbor, passed out in his barn at 2 p.m., surrounded by empty bottles and the woodworking tools he hadn't touched in years. He was physically unharmed, but when he woke up, he couldn't remember how he'd gotten there. More frightening, he couldn't remember what day it was. Callista had tried to get Ford to see a doctor, but he'd refused. He'd locked himself in his office and hadn't come out for 18 hours. She could hear him pacing, talking to himself, sometimes shouting at ghosts only he could see. "He keeps saying he's fine, but Steven, he's not fine. He's disappearing, and I don't know how to bring him back." Spielberg hung up the phone and sat in his own office for a long time, thinking about friendship and responsibility and the terrible moment when you realize that saving someone might require destroying your relationship with them. He picked up the phone and dialed Ford's direct line. It rang 12 times before Ford answered. "What do you want, Steven?" Ford's voice was flat, hostile in a way Spielberg had never heard before. "I want to talk to you about what happened the other night." "Nothing happened. I had a bad night. It's over. Harrison, Callista called me. She's worried about you. We all are." There was a long silence. When Ford spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, but somehow more dangerous. "Did she tell you about the barn? She told you I was passed out drunk like some common alcoholic. Is that what she said?" Spielberg chose his words carefully. "She said you'd had an accident. She was scared." "I don't have accidents, Steven. I make choices, and if I choose to drink myself to death in my own barn, that's my business, not yours, not Callista's, not anybody's." The words hung in the air like a confession and a threat at the same time. "Harrison, that's not a choice. That's giving up. Maybe I'm tired of not giving up. Maybe I'm tired of pretending that any of this matters. The movies, the awards, the legacy bullshit. Maybe I'm tired of being Harrison Ford." Spielberg felt something cold settle in his chest. In 40 years of friendship, he'd never heard Ford sound so completely defeated. "Do you want to talk about this in person? I can fly out there tonight?" "No, I don't want to see you. I don't want to see anyone. I want to be left alone to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do with whatever time I have left. And what if you can't figure it out alone? What if you need help?" Ford's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Help from who? You? The man who's been managing my career and my image for 40 years? The man who turned me into a product and then acts surprised when the product starts breaking down?" The accusation hit Spielberg like a physical blow. "That's not fair, Harrison. That's not what our friendship has been about, isn't it? Think about it, Steven. Every movie we've made together has been about you getting what you want out of me. Indiana Jones, the heroic everyman, Han Solo before that. Even our friendship, it's been about you having access to the version of me that makes your movies work." Spielberg was quiet for a moment, processing the pain and anger in Ford's voice. "If that's really what you think, then maybe we should talk about it." "There's nothing to talk about. I'm done talking. I'm done with all of it." Ford hung up. Spielberg sat staring at the phone, realizing that his best friend had just accused him of 40 years of exploitation. Worse, he wasn't sure Ford was entirely wrong. That night, Spielberg couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Ford's words, about their friendship, about the movies they'd made together. Had he been using Ford? Had their partnership been about Spielberg's vision and Ford's compliance, rather than genuine collaboration? He thought about the young actor he'd cast in Raiders of the Lost Ark, hungry and eager and full of ideas about who Indiana Jones could be. He thought about the older man who'd recently completed his final adventure as that character, exhausted and seemingly empty of everything that had made him special. Had Spielberg helped create Harrison Ford the legend, or had he helped destroy Harrison Ford the man? The question kept him awake until dawn. The next morning, Spielberg made a decision. He was going to Wyoming, whether Ford wanted to see him or not. Some conversations couldn't happen over the phone. But before he could book a flight, his phone rang. It was 3:17 a.m. Los Angeles time, which meant it was 4:17 a.m. in Wyoming. Ford was calling him. "Steven, I need to tell you something." Ford's voice was different now, quieter, sober, scared. "What is it, Harrison?" "I've been thinking about what I said yesterday, about you using me, about our friendship being fake. I was angry, and I said things that aren't true." Spielberg felt a moment of relief, but Ford wasn't finished. "The truth is worse than that. The truth is that I've been using you. For 40 years, I've been using our friendship to avoid dealing with who I really am. I've been hiding behind Indiana Jones and Han Solo and all these characters because the real me isn't nearly as interesting." Ford paused, and Spielberg could hear him breathing heavily. "I'm calling you at 3 a.m. because I'm sitting here with a gun in my hand, Steven, and I need you to talk me out of using it." The words hit Spielberg like ice water. "Harrison, where are you right now?" "I'm in my office. Callista's asleep upstairs. She doesn't know about the gun." "Okay, we're going to talk, and you're going to put the gun down. Can you do that for me?" "I don't know. I've been sitting here for 3 hours trying to figure out why I shouldn't, and I can't think of a good reason." Spielberg was already reaching for his car keys, his mind racing through options. Call 911, drive to LAX and catch the next flight to Wyoming, find a way to keep Ford talking until help arrived. "Harrison, I need you to listen to me. Everything you said yesterday about our friendship, about me using you, if any of that is true, then I need a chance to make it right. But I can't do that if you're not here." Ford was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know what the worst part is, Steven? The worst part is that I don't even know who I am without those characters. Take away Indiana Jones and Han Solo, and what's left? A carpenter from Chicago who got lucky. A guy who's been pretending to be a movie star for 50 years. That's not true."
"Isn't it? When was the last time you saw me as just Harrison Ford? Not the actor, not the legend, just the guy. When was the last time anyone did?"
Spielberg realized that Ford was right. Even in their most private moments, even in their closest conversations, there had always been an element of Harrison Ford, the persona between them. "You're right," Spielberg said quietly. "I haven't seen just Harrison in a long time, but I want to. I want to see my friend, not the movie star." Ford laughed, but it wasn't bitter this time. It was sad and tired. "What if there isn't anything to see? What if the guy you've been friends with for 40 years doesn't actually exist? Then we'll figure out who does exist, together." There was a long silence. Spielberg could hear Ford moving around, and then the sound of something heavy being set down. "I put the gun away." Spielberg exhaled for what felt like the first time in 10 minutes. "Thank you. Steven, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "Okay. Are we really friends, or are we just two people who've been working together for so long that we've mistaken professional respect for personal affection?" It was the question Spielberg had been dreading, because he wasn't entirely sure of the answer. "I think," Spielberg said carefully, "that we started as professional colleagues who became friends, but somewhere along the way, the professional relationship got so big that it overshadowed everything else. Maybe we lost track of the friendship part. So what do we do about that? We start over. We figure out who we are to each other without the movies, without the characters, without any of the stuff that's gotten in the way." Ford was quiet for a moment. "That scares me more than the gun did." "Why?" "Because what if we find out that without all the professional stuff we don't actually like each other very much?" Spielberg smiled, even though Ford couldn't see it. Harrison, you've been one of the most important people in my life for 4 decades. That doesn't happen because of movies. That happens because of who you are. Who am I, Steven? You're the guy who calls me when he's in trouble, even when he's angry at me. You're the guy who's never missed one of my kids' birthday parties, even when you were on location halfway around the world. You're the guy who sent me flowers when my mother died, not because it was professional courtesy, but because you knew I was hurting. Ford was crying now. Spielberg could hear it in his voice. I don't remember sending flowers. You were filming in Morocco. You called a florist in Los Angeles from your hotel room at 2 a.m. and had them deliver white roses to the funeral home. The card said, "From your friend," not from Harrison Ford, from your friend. I really don't remember that. That's okay. I remember it for both of us. They talked for 2 more hours. Not about movies or careers or legacy, but about friendship and fear and the strange experience of growing old in public. They talked about Ford's drinking and Spielberg's worries and the 40 years of accumulated misunderstandings that had brought them to this 3 a.m. phone call. When the sun came up in Wyoming, Ford was still on the phone. "Steven?" "Yeah. I think I want to see a doctor. About the drinking, about the memory stuff, all of it. I think that's a good idea. Will you come with me? Not as my director, not as my business partner, as my friend. Of course I will." 6 months later, Harrison Ford was sober. He'd been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, but with treatment and support, his condition had stabilized. More importantly, he'd started to figure out who he was when he wasn't being Harrison Ford, the movie star. He was a man who still loved building things with his hands, a husband who was learning to be vulnerable with his wife, a friend who was capable of deeper connections than he'd ever imagined. His friendship with Spielberg had been rebuilt on a foundation of honesty rather than professional convenience. They still worked together occasionally, but now their relationship existed independent of their careers. The 3 a.m. phone call that had nearly ended their friendship became the beginning of the most authentic relationship either man had ever experienced. It had taken 40 years and a gun on a desk in Wyoming, but they'd finally found their way to the truth about who they were to each other. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when everything else falls away. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what really matters. Harrison Ford and Steven Spielberg learned that friendship isn't about never hurting each other. It's about being willing to hurt each other with the truth when the lies become too dangerous to maintain. Their 40-year friendship didn't nearly end that night in October 2023. It finally began.